participating in this with me. I appreciate it. And bear with me, it's my first time ever doing a post-conference interview this formally. And so just thank you very much, and congratulations on an excellent lesson. I just want to start by reviewing the lesson, and if you hear anything that's not right, or if I mix something up, let me know. So your objective of the lesson was to have the students understand how to make one whole by adding fractions with unlike denominators. And you accomplished this by giving the students fraction blocks. So they had denominations of 1 whole, which was the hexagon, and then 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/6, and 1/12. And they had those blocks, and they could put them together on top of the hexagon whole in order to see how one could be made with various different combinations. You also had them fill out a sheet where they identified each color block as a certain fraction. So example, the blue was 1/3 and the red was 1/2. And you also had them build equations to show how they could add, for example, 1/2 plus 1/3 plus 1/6 equals 1 whole. And then at the end, you had them play a game where they would randomly choose the cards that were aligned to the fraction blocks to make 1 whole, and then the winner would be the person that was able to make 1 whole the quickest. Is that pretty accurate?
Yep.
Okay, good. And it was an excellent lesson, and it was a great idea for accomplishing that goal. What were your overall impressions of how the lesson went?
I think the lesson was very successful. All the kids were engaged, they were on task. It didn't matter what level of understanding they were, everyone was able to participate at their level, and because everybody was actively involved, there was not a whole lot of not off-task behavior going on.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there wasn't a whole lot of need for clarification, and it seemed, so that made it also show that they had a clear idea of what was expected of them.
Good. I would agree with that. It seemed like they were very engaged in the task. It seemed like they enjoyed it. How could you tell that they were engaged during the lesson?
They were all doing exactly what they needed to be doing. They weren't fooling around. They weren't making pictures with their blocks. They were all ferviously trying to come up with different combinations and figure out, strategize how best to fill up their hexagon.
Okay,
the
great.
best.
And did you feel that they acquired the objective of the lesson, and how do you know?
Well, the objective was to be the first person to fill up 3 hexagons with their fractions. So the fact that they were able to do that, some would question whether if they had too much, what should they do with their other piece, and so I was able to, depending on their ability level, send them down one path or another based on how complex they could understand, to make it easier for those that needed a little more help and harder for those that were understanding everything.
Okay. And what did you feel like were the most positive aspects of the lesson, or the aspects of the lesson that most encouraged them to learn or most helped them to learn?
I think because they were actually physically manipulating objects. It's not just numbers, random fractions that they see written on the board or on their paper. They actually had the actual fraction, and they could see where if I add 1/3 and 1/2, they see how much of the whole is filled up, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, just random numbers equal 1 whole. They were actually physically manipulating themselves and seeing with their eyes how the different shapes fit together.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I thought that was a really positive aspect of the lesson too, and I like the idea that you incorporate several different learning styles there. It's not just a visual or an auditory learner, but kids that like to manipulate and hold things in their hands. They had something concrete to really help them understand what a whole was. The lesson was excellent, but if you could redesign it, if you could go back and give it again, would you do anything differently to improve student learning? Would you redesign any one part of it? Why?
I think if I might have taken some of the harder fractions out for some of the groups to make it a little more basic to gain the concrete idea using the easier, bigger fractions, and then put in the smaller fractions so they understand that concept, and then you add the harder part by throwing in fractions that aren't as neat, that don't fit as nicely, so you have to do a little more
Like the 1/12
manipulation.
blocks?
The 1/12 and the 1/4 blocks
Okay.
are with the harder
Yeah.
ones. And so for some, I might have just taken those fractions out and said just use the easier ones and get a firm grip on that, and then we'll put in the extra ones. And then have the more advanced kids who grasp things quicker, you know, throw those in for them so they are more challenged.
That's a great idea, and it's great on a number of levels. You know, you're building it one step at a time, but it builds in differentiation into the lesson so that, you know, your more advanced kids may be able to be a little bit more interested during the lesson, while the kids that need a little bit more time can build it up but not really feel separated from the rest of the class. I want to start at the beginning of your lesson. At the beginning for your set, this wasn't the first time that your students had used manipulatives, in fact these manipulatives in your class before, and so you had reminded them of a similar game that you had played with some more basic fraction denominations, and that you were still exploring how to make one. In terms of your set, what was effective about it in terms of encouraging and priming them for learning?
Well, because they had already had the exposure with the bigger fractions, it wasn't as intimidating when they got the additional fractions, because they kind of had an idea in their mind from the previous activity. This time they had their own actual blocks as opposed to having to share, and so they could do what they were comfortable with as opposed to, you know, what they were able to do the last time. So it was a more hands-on personal experience, because before they were sharing blocks and it was just they made what they could out of what they had, and this time they were able to use their own and actually see for themselves, can I do this, do I get it, do I understand?
So you like the idea of reminding them because you're building on previous units.
Right.
In terms of activities that you could have added to the set, though, just that anticipatory set portion of the lesson, do you have any ideas of some, don't necessarily have to be grandiose things, but just some small activities that could have engaged student prior knowledge a little bit more, and get them primed for learning that lesson than just the reminder?
Well, I could have done an example on the board where I colored in shapes as opposed to just reminding them verbally, have somebody draw a card and then do the actual example on the board, so they're physically watching me and seeing what they have to do to remind them, not only verbally but also visually, of what the steps were and what was expected of them.
So, that's a great idea, because that's going to help the visual learners to understand and remember what they're going to have to do for the lesson. How about an activity that might engage the kinesthetic learners? The lesson is designed around engaging kinesthetic learners. How could you get them involved, do you think, in the set?
Well, we could have had just everybody did one round together, so I draw a card and say, okay, you have 1/6, everybody put 1/6 on your hexagon in front of you.
Okay.
And do it together as opposed to just watching up on the board.
And how do you think, if you had to do the lesson over again, how do you think adding those elements into the lesson might engage everybody? How do you think it might benefit everybody?
Well, then it would take away, if there was question at the beginning, if they were unsure, that would have taken away the question, and dive in with both feet as opposed to hesitantly wondering, is this what I'm supposed to be doing or not, so.
Good. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about was assessment at the end of the lesson. I felt that the center of the lesson was really strong. You had a lot of different learning styles addressed. You had great engagement on the part of the kids. And during the lesson too, you you assessed by checking their sheets that they were filling out, that they had associated the right fraction block to the correct fraction, that they were properly adding up those fractions to make one when they were doing the activity independently. And then at the end, you pulled them all together as a group, and you asked them how the game went, and you asked them why one student might have reached one and won the game first, as opposed to another. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to describe for me the ways that you felt those techniques were successful and the ways you thought they may have been improved.
I think that I could have had like a written assessment, that I could have had, each kid had their own paper that would check, like if I had certain shapes colored in, and have them write the fraction for each of those shapes that were filled in, so I could see if they could put from what they learned with the blocks to written paper.
Okay.
And then
What
also just have them explain to me their logic, their reasoning for why they put certain shapes in certain places, and why they would not change, like why they decided to put the shapes where they did, as opposed to just filling up one first and then moving on to the next one.
I love that idea, because giving them occasion to explain their thinking and kind of elucidate their logic to you and to the class, it not only... Sorry for 1 second.
Go.
Okay, sorry for the distraction. That's life with kids. So where we left off, I was praising you, because the idea to have their kids explain the logic out loud, it not only helps them to get out what they were thinking, but it helps you and other students to understand exactly the thought process that they use to get there. And we know in math, there's always more than one way to get there. And so that would be an excellent idea to incorporate that into any lesson. So I do want you to say, though, in your response, you gave a lot of suggestions for how you could have improved, but I want to hear what's successful too. What did you think was good about the way you designed your assessment?
Well, I think it was good for them to see that there's not just one way to get an answer. There's lots of different ways. There's different techniques to solve the problem.
That's by looking at the equations that they made to get one on the back of the sheet. Okay.
Right. So you also, as they played the game, did some of them want to fill up one whole hexagon first, or did some say, oh, that piece is too big, I'm going to put it on another one, as opposed to splitting up that big piece and saying, I want to fill up this one first and then I'll start on the next one. And that's a good way to challenge the people that have a firm understanding of what they're doing, is to say, okay, now instead of just putting them wherever you have spot for them, now you have to split it up and fill up one hexagon before you can go on to the next hexagon, which means you have to divide the fraction and fill in whatever you have left, and take the leftovers and put it on the start of another one, and make them have to split up the fraction and do it in a concrete way where they're seeing the two different pieces that make up the one piece that they pulled.
And that's interesting too, because that not only allows you to see that they're getting the basic objective of the lesson, which is to understand how to make one, but also to understand how to split making one up. That's what sets up your next lesson, as you kind of build on the idea of adding fractions, and fractions that make a whole, fractions that make more than a whole, that make less than a whole. I like that. That's a great idea. So just overall, if you were to do this lesson again, in terms of the assessment, what do you think, in addition to what you had, might be one or two things that you could add in to address the needs of several different learners. I like the idea of the out loud explanation too. That I think should definitely go in.
Well, you can always have a written assessment that goes along with it where they have to, if you give them numbers, they have to color in on color in the shape, the different fractions on the shape. Writing out the actual fractions that go along, what did they come, not only the combinations that they came up with just randomly, but what combinations did they actually do on each of their hexagons to equal one whole.
And writing them out.
And writing them out to see where the color pieces actually equal a fraction and how all of those fractions added together equal the one whole.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your willingness to work with